Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack, and I hope that you all had a good holiday, whatever that is that you've been celebrating this past month. This will be the final podcast episode of 2025. Obviously, it's the last week of 2025 when this will release. And as Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever you're celebrating ends, and things start to shift into a year in review or highlighting the most impactful stories of the previous year as we start a new year. Spotify gives you your year in review in terms of the top music that you've listened to. All of these things are about wrapping up one year to start another. And I think as the year comes to an end, there is a lot of pressure to wrap things up, whether that's to summarize, to find the lesson, of this past year, and to turn this past year into something meaningful and neat and tidy. This episode isn't about doing that. It's not about resolutions or fresh starts or reinventing yourself for the new year. Because we've seen the research, that isn't actually helpful. I've talked to different clients over the years. I've realized that they feel the same way that I do about New Year's resolutions. They don't like them. It feels like just another useless platitude. What I do think is helpful is to take this time at the beginning of something new, ending of something that has been, and to reflect. I think this time asks us to tell the truth about the year that we actually lived and letting that truth steady us as we move forward. If you're ending this year feeling changed, maybe that's in a way that you're quieter, or you're unsure how to even name what shifted. You're not alone. I think sometimes New Year's resolutions bypass that process. So let's start with talking about why New Year's resolutions often fail. And I think it's important to start here because this is where so many people quietly decide that something is wrong with them. After the holidays, maybe they've overeaten, they've spent more time generally with their family of origin than other times. And we know that New Year's resolutions tend to fail not because people lack discipline or motivation, but because of how they're formed and when they're formed. Most New Year's resolutions start with an implicit message. I should be different than I am. Even when they're framed positively. I want to be healthier. I want to be calmer. I want to be more organized. Underneath, there's still a sense that who I am right now isn't enough. And while shame might produce short bursts of change, it doesn't produce sustainable growth because it creates pressure. And pressure is something our nervous system often resists. Resolutions are also usually built on the idea that if we just try harder, everything will change. But willpower is a very thin layer of capacity. When we're tired, grieving, recovering, stressed, or coming out of a long season of survival, our nervous system will always override our intention. Our nervous system's job is to keep us safe, not to help us reinvent ourselves based on a calendar date. And we can't out-resolve a nervous system that's still trying to protect us. Another reason that resolutions fail is they often ask for change before there's understanding. They skip the most important question. Why does this pattern exist in the first place? Some of these patterns came about legitimately, whether that's overworking as an adaptive skill, avoiding to keep the peace, numbing to help survive, or other roles that we took on to preserve attachment. When we try to eliminate a behavior without honoring what it protected us from, something else often rushes in to take its place. And the last thing I want to say about resolutions is January is a terrible time to demand transformation. January comes after holidays, after loss, after family, after reflection, and after exhaustion. For many people, January is a low energy, high expectation month. So if you notice that January feels heavy or slow or unmotivated, that's not failure. That's how your body feels. I've often said, while I know January has 31 days, like many other months, it feels so much longer. And I think it's important to remember that we don't plant seeds in frozen ground and expect growth. And then the last thing I'll say about why resolutions often don't work is they confuse identity change with behavior change. A lot of resolutions aren't actually about changing habits. They're more about changing identity. They're based in this idea that I'm going to be a different kind of person, or this year I'm not going to struggle. This year I'll finally be healed. But identity doesn't change because we demand it. It changes because we live differently long enough that the story we tell about ourselves updates. Instead of resolutions, I find that it's much more helpful to think in terms of orientation. Orientation is how we respond when things are hard, where you turn under stress, what you reach for when you're overwhelmed. Orientation also isn't declared in January. It's not even something that we can declare. Instead, it's revealed over time. So if you're ending 2025 without goals, without clarity, without a nice story to wrap it all up, or without motivation to reinvent yourself, nothing's gone wrong. Instead, this may be a season of integration, of looking at what has been. And integration is not passive. It's what allows the next step to actually hold. Most resolutions fail not because people lack discipline, but because they're made in opposition to how humans actually change. Change sticks when it comes from understanding, not urgency. I've said over the years with a lot of clients that I've worked with that closure is a myth. And I want to spend some time unpacking this because I think it really matters when we're placing it at the end of a year. We tend to think of closure as something we're supposed to arrive at. Like if we just understand what happened, or if we just have the right conversation or get the right explanation, then we can finally move on. But when change is unexpected, when a relationship ends, a role shifts, or a season closes without warning, waiting for closure can actually keep us stuck. When this happens, we tend to stay oriented towards something that's already over. I'll share some personal stories about how this has looked for me and the things that I've reflected on as this year comes to a close. And some of the shifts that I'm noticing are still in process for me. And as I usually do with episodes around this time of year, I talk about my mom's death, which happened this time of year. But I want to start with something that I learned about closure years before my mom died, through a painful ending that didn't involve death at all. Years ago, our family was very close with two other families in our neighborhood. Our kids were friends. We were friends as couples. We vacationed together, shared meals together. We spent a lot of time together as families. And then very suddenly, it ended. Now, looking back, I can see that the fracturing was happening the previous couple of months, 2 months maybe, leading up to the ending. But what happened was myself, my spouse, my kids, we were cut out of the friend group. There wasn't a repair process. There wasn't a conversation that brought clarity about why this happened. Although at the time it ended, there were cruel words that were said. It definitely felt like we got kicked out of the friend group. And we still lived in the same neighborhood. We went to the same church, and our kids went to the same schools. I knew at the time that trying to salvage the friendship probably wouldn't be good for us. And I also knew myself well enough and admitted to my husband that if I were given the opportunity to salvage it, I'd probably try anyway, even if that wasn't healthy. The other two families remained friends. We adjusted. It wasn't easy. I remember a couple months after the friendship ended, my husband and I were driving in the car. And if I remember right, the two of us were going out to dinner, but we also didn't want to go where the other four might be. And so the conversation about the friendship ending came up. And I asked him, does this feel so painful to you? It feels really painful to me, emotionally painful. And he agreed. And I told him, I think the intensity of this pain may last 2 years. Now, that was a random time frame I threw out. I think it was just my way of speaking to the intensity of the pain that I felt. And it spoke to how difficult it was. Our kids did make new friends. As a couple, we didn't really replace those friendships. But instead, as our kids moved into their teen years, we were more available parents than we would have been otherwise. 9 years later, we moved about 40 minutes away And it felt freeing in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Not because anything felt unfinished back where we lived, but instead the geography of where we moved to finally matched our emotional reality. By that point, when we moved, our family was in a strong place. We had left the religion we were part of. I feel like our relationships as a family were solid, and our life had moved on, and many good things had happened over those 9 years. 2 years after we moved, 11 years after the friendship ended, one of the friends sent me a friend request on social media. When the friendship ended years earlier, I'd been blocked. So just nonchalantly, 11 years later, getting this friend request was a surprise. I texted this friend and I acknowledged the request surprised me. I also said, I don't want to make this anything more. I get that it's just a friend request. She told me she had missed our family over the years and couldn't even remember why the friendship had ended, which was surprising to me. I told her, I don't know exactly why, but I remember what was said to me. She shared that they had also moved, that they were no longer friends with the third family, and that they had left the religion as well. And she suggested getting together for dinner to talk about our experiences, deconstructing and leaving religion, and even our experiences living in that particular neighborhood. And when that invitation came and I thought about it, it was clear to me that my answer was no. Not out of anger. I don't even think it was out of hurt at that point. But because I knew there was nothing there for us to reopen. We had been friends, and it didn't last. That's when I realized closure had happened. Not because the ending made any more sense to me now, but because I and we as a family had learned to move forward. What brought us peace wasn't understanding the ending. It was living beyond it. It was moving forward without resolution. Now, at the time, that could have been just true about relationships. But what I've realized is it was also something true about grief. 3 years after this friendship ended, my mom died unexpectedly. And everything I thought I understood about closure was put to the test. Looking back, I'm grateful I had already learned how to begin the process of moving forward without closure, because my mom's death didn't offer it either. So when I say that closure is a myth, this belief doesn't come from theory for me. It comes from lived experience. What I've learned both personally and clinically is that if closure comes at all, it usually comes because we move forward, not before. And this understanding became undeniable for me when my mom died. December 30th this year marks 11 years since her passing. And my relationship with my mom was difficult and complex. Not just at the end, but I would say for most of my life, I was the caretaker in my family. And my mom experienced that as a threat. She told me that directly a couple of times. And I've often said that even though I was the second of six kids, I was her sixth favorite. And that really didn't just stop with me. My kids felt that distance too. The day she died started like any other. I was working. It was actually the only day that week that I had any clients scheduled. And my mom had planned a sleepover for the grandkids that started later that afternoon. I actually talked to her on the phone that day about 2:30 in the afternoon for maybe 20 minutes. We didn't talk about anything significant. I was letting her know that my kids would be a little bit late. She asked if they could bring some games that we had. And during my 3 p.m. session, my phone, which was sitting on the table next to my chair, rang several times. Now it's on mute, but you can see when the screen lights up. And it was my youngest brother, which I thought was kind of strange. I let it go to voicemail. He called right back. Screen lit up. I let it go to voicemail. And he called a third time. Again, I'm in the middle of a session. So I just turned my phone over so me and the client couldn't continually see the screen light up. And I planned to call him back as soon as the session ended. Maybe 10 minutes later, there was a knock on my office door. I knew I was the only person in the building that day. So it was surprising that somebody knocked on the door. When I opened it, my husband was standing there and said, "We have to go now." When I looked back at the client, he'd already started putting on his coat. And I don't know what he heard, but he hurriedly left. And my husband then told me, "We need to go to the hospital. Your mom's been taken there by ambulance." On the way to the hospital, he told me what happened. My youngest brother, who had been calling me, had gone to my mom's house early to drop off his kids. His wife and he had plans that night, so they needed to drop their kids off earlier. And he ran inside because the plan was to exchange car seats so that my mom would have the car seats if she needed to go anywhere. And he would help transfer them from his car to my mom's car. When he went in the house, he found her unconscious on the floor. Her coat was on, her keys were in her hand. He called 911 and did CPR until EMS arrived. And then he called me. And when I didn't answer, he called my husband. It took my brother a minute to head to the hospital because he had to figure out what to do with his two small kids. The neighbor we grew up with across the street who taught preschool, she took them. So we got to the hospital about the same time my brother did. And we walked in the ER and we were told she's in room 2. I remember thinking, that sounds reassuring. I expected to walk in and see her awake sitting in the bed. Instead, we got to room 2, where doctors and nurses were working on her. My brother and I stopped in the doorway and watched. My husband was standing behind us. And I remember seeing the physician look up at the clock and call the time. She never regained consciousness. The doctor came over and gave his condolences. And then they left us the room. My mom still laying on the table. My brother and I divided up first who was going to call which sibling, and then the other people we needed to call. Every phone call required us to repeat the bad news that she was gone because no one could take it in. One of my brothers and his family were up skiing that day, and I called. He stopped, answered the phone, and I gave the bad news. My grandpa, my mom's dad, couldn't process it when I called him. He kept asking me, "What are you saying?" My husband left and went to go pick up my grandpa at his house and bring him to the hospital. Our siblings arrived. Aunts and uncles who were nearby came. My oldest daughter drove our other kids to the hospital so they could be with us. At one point, I think evening had come. I'm sitting in the room. My phone buzzed. It was the client I'd seen earlier that day whose session was interrupted, texting to say, "I hope everything's okay." And that was how my relationship with my mom ended. No final words, no goodbyes, no warning, and no time for any repairs. If closure were something that had to happen in order for healing to begin, I would have been permanently stuck in that doorway. As the first anniversary of my mom's death approached, I wrote something that still feels true. I wrote, "I'm grieving. I've been in the mode of grief for almost a year. It's not something you can see by looking at me. It's not even something you can hear in most of the conversations I have, but it's there. I feel it. Grief takes up space in my life, in my body, in my heart. Grief has kept my heart softer, more open. It has slowed me down and caused me to pause more often, to reflect on things I might otherwise hurry past. It has unlocked memories from my earliest childhood more deeply. I wrote, "At times, grief feels like a burden I can barely carry. It has been a constant companion and an unyielding teacher." As I moved through that first year, I found myself reading and listening to people who had walked this path before me. Stephen Colbert has said things about grief that have stayed with me. He talked about grief not being the size of you, but being its own size, something that visits you, something you don't control, something that will always accept the invitation to appear. I've always loved that phrase, visited by grief, because that's what it feels like. Grief isn't something I contain or manage. It arrives. It has its own presence. Another writer described grief like the ocean, coming in waves, ebbing and flowing, sometimes calm, sometimes overwhelming. The author said, "All we can really do is learn to swim." I wrote, "I'm learning that grief takes time. There are moments when I want to hurry it, fix it, make it go away, feel something besides the ache in my chest. But grief doesn't respond to urgency." As the year moved on, I wrote, "Grief changed with the seasons. What felt quieter in the heat of July became sharper again as December approached. Memories that had been in the background moved forward again. The memory of calling my grandpa and telling him my mom was gone. Helping my youngest daughter with her hair one morning before school. And she told me she felt sad because her class had started singing Christmas songs. And that reminded her of grandma's passing. Grief doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in cycles. As Colbert said, grief is a thing. Right now, in that first year, it was acute. There wasn't a day I didn't think about her and about that day, about how I was changed. I trusted that someday those memories wouldn't hurt in the same way. Not because they would disappear. I knew they wouldn't disappear, but because I would continue living. And that's what I've learned since. Grief didn't end because I found closure. It softened because I moved forward with it. Stephen Colbert described grief as something that visits us, something that has its own size and can step out of the shadow when we don't expect it. It always has time for us. And I've found that to be true. Grief isn't something I manage. It appears and it sits with me. And when it shows up, I have to make time for it. Even now, 11 years later, there is almost always a day during this week between Christmas and New Year's when grief appears. It steps out of the shadows and it sits with me. It doesn't always look the same as it did. Some years it's still sharp. Some years it's quieter. Some years it's heavier, but it still shows up. And I don't see that as a failure of healing. I see it as the rhythm of grief. As siblings, as we approached the 5-year anniversary of my mom's death, something shifted. My sister-in-law told me, I think at a Christmas Eve gathering, that my brother had shared with her that he still thought about that day every single day. The phone call, the days leading up to the funeral. He said it all moved in slow motion. And she asked me, do you think that's weird? And I said, no, it's the same for me. I think we realized that maybe it was time to take our grief from something we experienced individually and to start sharing our grief together. For the first 5 years after she died, we didn't really talk about our mom on December 30th. We all knew that was the reason we got together on the 30th. And I don't know that we were avoiding grief. I think we had to grieve individually before we could grieve together. That's when we started creating questions. Memories, things we admired about my mom, and even things that were hard. I think my husband was the first one to draw a question that wasn't necessarily kind. I think the question said something like, what is something about Susan that you didn't like? That's a hard question. It's a hard question for an in-law. He can be very good on the spot like that. And came up with the perfect answer, something we all knew that was true. He said, I teased her about this. I've been outspoken about this. I didn't like her cooking. Her cooking was really bad. Some years we can talk more honestly about the things that were hard. Other years we'll stay focused on things we admired, the positive memories. A couple of years before my mom passed away, our family had started a tradition. It was actually the weekend after Thanksgiving when we first started it. Every family would make a pie. The men in the family made the pie because typically for Thanksgiving, it was not the men who made the pie. And so the men, the weekend after Thanksgiving, would make a pie. We'd get together and we'd do a taste test and we'd rate whose pie was the best and we'd vote on the best pie. One of my brothers had even gotten a trophy at a thrift store with the woman on top and made a tiny little pie out of clay and glued it onto the top of her hand. Trophy says first place. And it's a traveling trophy. Whoever wins the pie contest got to keep the trophy and the bragging rights for a year. After my mom passed, we decided to move the pie competition to December 30th in honor of her, because it was a fairly new tradition when she passed, and she loved it. Even now, I'm not sure we're particularly good as siblings at sharing our grief together. And I think that says something important about the house we grew up in and about the marriage our parents had. The hurt my dad gave my mom and the hurt she gave us. Our dad died, if I remember correctly, 25 years ago. We don't talk about him. We don't gather on the day he died. In fact, he's largely missing from our collective conversations. Earlier this year, during a family crisis, we talked about him. And we talked about mom, about the impact they both had on us. And when the crisis faded, the insight left and the conversation stopped. I think that's how family systems often work. Insight emerges in a crisis, and it recedes when things stabilize. Maybe it recedes so stabilization can happen. I think this is why I push back so strongly on the idea of closure. Because if closure meant that grief disappears, obviously something's wrong with me. What I will say now that I find true is that grief didn't resolve. It integrated. Closure didn't come because this story or this relationship finally makes sense. It has come because I learned how to live forward without needing it to be finished. I think that's often how we know something has been integrated. Not because we necessarily understand it or accept it, but because it no longer pulls us backward. Waiting for closure can keep us tethered to hope, to an explanation, or repair that is never going to come. Movement is often what creates the peace we think that closure will give us. I've noticed this same pattern in my work this past year. I've talked a bit about how work has changed this past year and about listening to my intuition after a long season of stress that's work-related. What I'm noticing now is that clarity doesn't always come with instructions. It comes as perspective. As the shifts happened and the insight came, I observed things about myself. I didn't jump forward to make changes. I wasn't sure if I was avoiding or if I was accepting and trying to integrate. But I still wasn't necessarily making decisions. What I would say now, a couple of months after that had all come to the surface, is that I'm taking thoughtful, proactive steps rather than just reacting. Nothing is really being abruptly changed. I think the work that I do with clients and with the employees that I do have remains grounded in continuity and relationship. There hasn't necessarily been a disruption to that, but there is discernment that has got me thinking about the shift that is happening, about the shift that has happened, about what comes next, about how this evolves, about how all of this needs to evolve. And I think the clarity is that I'm not entirely in charge of all of this. I don't get to control this. This understanding about grief, about closure, and about movement has shaped how I think about family roles, personally, about my role of caretaking and the transitions that I've been navigating this year. Two years ago, in a session with my therapist, we had had several conversations where I was realizing that I had outgrown this role of caretaking, that I needed to start putting it down more than I had. But this past year required me to put it down in a more real way. Any reassurance about what happens to the family relationships without getting permission or having agreement, and without knowing how things will resolve. What I do know is that caretakers often confuse responsibility with love, and we don't really learn how to trust others. I often say about caretakers that if we could trust others, the role of caretaking would not have been required for us to step into. I had a conversation with one of my siblings the week of Christmas, but before Christmas, in which I circled back to something she had shared with me the week before. And I told her, I said, I don't know that I have felt any of my family members have my back in the way that you did in that moment. And I wanted to acknowledge that and acknowledge how much that meant to me. We talked about my episode on the family roles we inherit. She had just started listening to that episode. And in many ways, she was also a caretaker in our family. She's 11 years younger than me. So her caretaking looked different than it did being the fifth of six kids than it did for me being the second of six kids. Putting a role down doesn't mean that you stop loving, but it does mean that you have to stop disappearing. It does require the real you to start showing up. This year, for me, also brought about quieter transitions. The last of our kids moved out. Both of our dogs are now gone. The noise level in our house has changed. The evenings after work are a lot quieter. None of this was a crisis, and none of it was nothing. It is something. And as I've reflected on the events this past year that have shaped me, that brought me to where I am right now, I think they're connected. I think they all interplay with the work ahead of me, even though I'm not exactly sure what that looks like. So much of grief isn't about loss. I mean, it's about loss, but it's also about reorientation. Here's some questions that I want to pose to you that I have found helpful in years past at the end of a year when I'm reflecting, when I'm unsure, when I feel a shift, but can't even always name it. Or I know how to name them and put my finger on it, but I'm not sure where they're taking me. The first one is, what am I still waiting for closure on? What might shift if I move forward without it? What role am I playing that I am ready to put down? And what capacity have I earned this year? Oftentimes, things that we are carrying forward aren't chosen, but the wisdom in it is. It's earned. For me, one of the places I've learned to move forward, literally, is the pool. In 2019, I signed myself up for one-on-one swimming lessons. I didn't grow up swimming laps. I think my first lesson, the teacher asked me if I had ever taken swimming lessons before and if I actually knew how to swim. And I said, I took swimming lessons for 2 weeks when I was 6 years old. And he said, and what do you remember from that? And I said, I remember the neighbor boy that we carpooled the swim lessons with, jumping up and then coming back down into the water and hitting the bottom of his chin on the side of the pool. And it cut it open and blood went everywhere. And then I said, but I never learned how to breathe underwater. So that's probably where we need to start. The idea for signing myself up for swimming lessons wasn't nostalgia. It was something new. I had read that swimming can be great for people with asthma. I think what I was reading was really for kids with asthma, and I was 49 years old. But, I found out I had asthma when I was 45. So I thought, well, I've only been diagnosed for 4 years, so it's kind of like I'm a kid learning about asthma. Swimming has become one of the few places where my mind quiets, where I feel my body, and where things that feel tangled start to line up a little more clearly. There's something about being in the water, the rhythm, the repetition, the breath, that reminds me I don't have to solve anything. I just have to keep moving. And I'll be honest, as we head into January, there is one thing I'm not looking forward to. The gym is about to get very busy. And the pool, which has been relatively calm and predictable, is about to be filled with people who made New Year's resolutions. I'll be sharing a lane with people who may be very motivated, but maybe not very oriented. I'll be sharing with people who are counting laps like they're negotiating with themselves, and people trying to finish something as quickly as possible. But the truth is, swimming doesn't work if you rush it. You don't get calmer by trying harder. And you don't get clarity by thrashing. In one of my early swimming lessons, my instructor observed that when I hit the place in the pool where it crossed into the deep end, my speed accelerated. I swam very fast. And he asked, "Do you have anxiety?" I jokingly said, "Look, I'm part of the Jaws generation. And while I know logically there are no sharks in swimming pools, that movie scared the crap out of me." So we worked on it. And I learned that swimming has a rhythm. And if I interrupt that rhythm, it messes up the breathing. And I find my rhythm by breathing and by moving forward one length at a time. So I'll be patient with January swimmers. I know they're doing their best. Change doesn't happen just because we declare it. It happens because we keep showing up, even when the pool gets crowded. If you're ending this year without closure, without clarity, or without a resolution that you feel good about, you're not behind. Nothing monumental happens from December 31st to January 1st. Next year is an extension of this year. You're already moving. And sometimes that's the most honest place to end. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.